everyone. Good afternoon, everybody. You have joined the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy's first 2022 Little Nuggets of Tech and Telecom lunch session. And we're really excited to be kicking off the year with our special guest. But first, let me greet our inimitable co-host who has traveled from Chicago to New York. Hey, Jen Fritchie, how are you?
Good. How are you, Carolyn? Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Although I think are we officially no longer allowed to say that
I
after January 9th, I think.
think.
There's so much going on inside the Beltway, despite the weather and the snow. And as lots of issues going on in the policy space. And now that we know the planes are not going to be falling out of the sky, which was, the last couple of weeks of drama, so much fun.
Right.
Was wondering what your top issue is for 2022 when you think about policy.
From policy, I think actually it's a lot about what we're going to be talking about. I'm headed down to Miami next week for Metro Connect, and I can tell you that business is back and fiber is the focus for all of us. All sorts of fiber to the home, fiber, enterprise fiber, and all that comes with it. So that's going to be a happening conference. So I'm excited to be a part of it.
And as you won't be surprised to know, because I am a dork and I do live here, technically outside the Beltway, but in the Beltway for all intents and purposes, broadband. It's kind of like back in the day when everybody was asking, is this the year of mobile data? We've been talking about things like the digital divide for decades. And I think finally, with the right policy levers that are coming into focus and being put in place, and the amount of money that's been put into the system, not just with current funding from the legislation that just passed for broadband infrastructure, but prior inputs, is how do we have the tools and the money to finally close the digital divide so that we can have a different conversation a year or two from now. And so with that, I wanted to welcome our special guest, who is the CEO of LuLAC, Sindy Benavides. Sindy, thank you so much for being our first guest of 2022 and bringing such an important and unique perspective on these top issues. So welcome from here in DC and via Chicago and New York. How are you?
Carolyn and Jen, thank you so much for having me. I am really excited to be joining you today. As I think of the issue of technology and broadband, it's one of the issues that for us has always been important, top 6 issue. But as we've lived through the pandemic, it surfaced as a top 2 priority for our organization. And, for individuals that don't know the League of United Latin American Citizens, LuLAC, we are the oldest and largest national Latino civil rights organization in the country, established in 1929.
Well, I was going to say, before we delve into the finer points of broadband policy, which I'm sure will be scintillating discussion for everyone listening and for those who will listen after the fact, would you mind telling some of our audience who may not be as familiar with you and the great work LuLAC has been doing a little bit about the organization? And as you just said, where do issues like closing the digital divide fit within the mission of LuLAC and your vision as a CEO?
To start on a personal level, Carolyn, I have been a LuLAC volunteer member since 2006. And in 2012, joined the national office as Director of Civic Engagement. 2018 became the Chief Operating Officer. In 2017, and rather in 2018, stepped in as the CEO, the first Latina to lead this organization in 90 years, and also the youngest leader, to put it in context, leading a national legacy organization in the country, which means that I am a millennial. I do have a PhD in texting. I'm very adept with checking messages in my phone, but also very good with email. And, since 2006, we have really made sure that LuLAC has continued to grow its grassroots footprint across the country. A lot of people don't know that a lot of our volunteers they are volunteers. They're not paid. These are people who are committed to advancing the mission of LuLAC across the 35 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico, where we currently have councils. And so for me, it's really an honor to be able to have climbed up first as a volunteer member, as a council president, then joining the national office, to now being the CEO of the organization. And, as I think of the vision for LuLAC, One, we know that we are still living in a pandemic. I think we're all still waiting to see what different version or form of COVID we see in the coming months. But we know that as the pandemic hit, we had no other option but to adapt. And what we did as LuLAC was utilize our branding, our almost 93-year-old branding, as well as our platform to communicate with our booming Latino community across America. And our core pillars is really, advancing the economic condition, educational attainment, housing, political influence, and civil rights of Latinos in America. We know that in recent years, technology has not only become a luxury, but truly a necessity. And before the pandemic, our LuLAC members talked about technology. I'm going to dive in a little bit more later in the segment in terms of what we have been doing for several decades. But since the pandemic hit, this has become a top two issue, which tells you the significance of technology, of broadband, and all the issues that fall under.
And really, really quick, you shared something with us as we were prepping for the call. Previously, these, we'll call it the suite of issues, were ranked only in the, I would say, the top 10, right? Or certainly not rising to the occasion of being the number 2 area of focus, which, as you said, is tremendous. Jen.
For us, Carolyn and Jen,
Yes.
it's the bread and butter issues, right? When we think of campaigns and elections, right? The economy, education, health, but for us, technology has surfaced as a bread and butter issue, and it's one where we continue to do work because of the impact that LuLAC has with the community directly. For us, this literally became a necessity, and one that we will continue to advocate on for years to come.
Absolutely.
Right. Well, I'll start, and I'm just wondering, with all the experience you've seen in LuLAC, and what would your advice be to us? How are effective ways to invest the gobs of capital coming to this space? It's clearly the attention and the capital is behind it, but there can be a misstep. And I'm curious as to what are some lessons learned that you'd share with us as to how to effectively invest this capital so we don't see, the homework gap continue to, be shown.
I appreciate that question so much, Yan, because during the pandemic, we saw a lot of learning lessons. We also saw a lot of good happen, right? During the pandemic, we saw so many tech companies step up as good corporate citizens and donate hardware to families, to communities, to schools. LuLAC, for example, we work with a multitude of partners, and I'll give you an example of two, but I could literally go down a ladder and tell you what we did with all of the telecom companies that we work with. So to give you a sense, with AT&T, they have their program Access from AT&T, and it's really providing that wireline home internet to low-income households. So LuLAC, part of what LuLAC did was amplify and do that outreach and awareness and disseminating that information through our grassroots councils and members. We also serve on the External Diversity Council for T-Mobile, and because of our service there, we knew firsthand of Project 10 Million, which, to your point, Jen, it's closing the homework gap with more than 9 million children across America who are experiencing this. A lot of people don't know that so many of our children, and I say our children because I have two of them that are 4 and 6, so many of our children are completely left out. I have passed, Dunkin' Donuts, I have passed McDonald's, and I have seen cars with families inside who are literally there tapping into the Wi-Fi to be able to do their homework. And so as Americans, I really think it's building this consciousness that if we're to thrive as an economy, as a country, we cannot leave any of our communities behind. And that includes not only vulnerable communities, but it also includes our communities who may be in rural parts of America where there's a technology desert that exists. And so as we're thinking of the future of America, we have to think holistically. We have to make sure that, as they would say in the military, we leave no one behind, and that we're not only thinking of the next 2 to 5 years, but truly, how do our choices today, or how are the decisions that we make today, how will that impact the next generation? Not only my children, but my children's children.
Right, right.
If you don't mind, let's dig a little bit deeper, Jen, and follow on that question. And I guess you LULAC has been very much engaged at the grassroots level, not just communicating information about plans and opportunities that are available, but I think you guys have been at this for a long time. In which case, I wonder if you have some lessons learned from prior attempts to close the digital divide. For example, what comes to mind is BTOP under a few administrations ago, which was really focused on trying to increase adoption. And as we know, the broadband question here in the United States has really got two parts to it, as you know, right? There's the access part, literally bringing either fiber or spectrum or both to areas or locations that don't have actual access to the internet. And then simultaneously, though, is this issue of adoption, right? Which is both the affordability conversation, the relevance conversation, the, training and explaining how this can be used across a host of issues to close the homework gap, to improve your access to health services, et cetera. So are there maybe two or three or more, however many examples or thoughts you might have to shed light on things either we want to emulate now that the NTIA and FCC is creating programs to disseminate and procedures to disseminate this money, or things that you feel that might not have been the best idea and would be something to avoid this time around?
Sure, I would say there's a couple of things, Carolyn, and before I dive in, I would flag that LuLAC has been at this, and I give full credit to our former executive director, Brent Wilkes, because in 2004, Brent created the Empower Hispanic America with Technology. And this is before there was the term closing the digital divide that we all know today. And what that did back in 2004 to today is for LuLAC create 67 community centers in over 25 states, targeting not only students, but parents, as well as low-income individuals, and serving millions of underserved Latinos to date to make sure that they have this access to technology. As we think of lessons learned, one is that we must make the necessary investment. And it's important that we don't, as we don't just put Band-Aids, right? At some point, those Band-Aids are going to come off. We need to make sure we're thinking for the long term and making that investment today for the long term. I would also say, when we look most recently at EBB, and we serve on the board of HTTP, which created EBB para mí, or EBB for me in Spanish, is that oftentimes our government fails to add outreach dollars. And so the dilemma that government often has is that they have the funding to create the website, they have the staff, but they don't have the outreach dollars to reach the community. And so what good is having a website if no one is aware that this website exists and that the program exists? And that's why even when you see EBB, right, which was with 36 million Americans who were eligible for it, the FCC was only able to sign up 6 million, which is 6 million more than before, but there's still 30 million Americans who would be eligible for it. And so we really do have to think holistically of the different steps that it takes to reach our community. And, one example that I can give you is that as, we were building that awareness around COVID, we partnered with different companies like Walgreens to go into the community, like physically go, even in a pandemic, to raise that awareness. And so part of our thinking has to be, how do we meet the community where they are? And also think, just to capitalize on this, right, is that the fight for broadband access is one that's a fight for everyone. We see it as a civil rights issue. Communities are literally being left behind. And this impacts their economic future. This impacts if they're even able to access healthcare. This impacts the education of our children. This impacts the future of America. And so as we think of technology, it's really making sure that we are meeting the community where they are. If there's a point that I can drive home, is that, for so many of us that are DC insiders, and I happen to have our headquarters happens to be in DC. I happen to be quote unquote a DC insider. I live in Northern Virginia. I commute every day into DC. Is that we think about our vulnerable communities, whether it's in San Antonio, Texas, or whether it's in Wisconsin, or whether it's in Puerto Rico, that we're really thinking of all the communities that our country encompasses, and that we are figuring out what those solutions are. I would say, so the first one was making sure we're investing. The second one is meeting our community where we are. And then I would say the third one is really thinking in different dimensions, right? Understanding that the diversity of our community is what makes America strong. And even within the Latino segment, you have individuals who English is their second language. And so also understanding that on top of the barriers that we already talked about, there's additional barriers. I can also think of our tribal communities who have those additional barriers that impact them. And so for us, Carolyn, is really thinking, again, how do we meet with the community where they are? What are those additional barriers that they're confronting, and what can we do as society, as government, in the private sector to make sure we meet those needs?
Well, it's easy to see why you were selected as the youngest CEO. Very impressive and very succinct explanation for how we might be able to, as Jen was referencing, spend the money a little more wisely this time around from the federal and state governments. But let me, if you don't mind, if we could just drill down a little bit more. You touched on two issues that are uniquely relevant to the Georgetown Center, which is economics. And you mentioned how important technology was for across a number of different interests and issues of concern and relevance to your communities and your constituencies, but in particular, you mentioned economic opportunities. Can you delve into that a little bit more and help us understand, from your perspective, how do we tackle this issue of relevance? I mean, number one is clearly, as you just said, the language issue. So much of this information must be available in languages that communities are speaking and that they can understand, and that is accessible. So, full stop. But second, and connecting folks with the right opportunities, how do you see all of this money in the programs kind of helping you and others realize your objective on the economic opportunities that can potentially be created by more and faster broadband access to your communities?
Well, I would say there's a saying that, health is your wealth. So if health is your wealth, technology is your future. And, as we think of technology and the investments that need to be made, first and foremost, the emergency broadband benefit program, I think what that did is recognize the need that so many Americans have in terms of having affordable internet service, especially during this pandemic. And, what we saw was $3.2 billion investment in COVID relief funds for the FCC. But what we saw there, the gap again, was enrolling the millions and millions of Americans who were in need of this. I would also say that as we're thinking of the digital divide, and as we think of the transition of EBB now into ACP, that we think of that transition and how that impacts families, right? The fact is that not everyone may be able to re-enroll by the March deadline. And so we really need to think, how do we make it easy for families who are literally, living day to day, right? Like they're waking up to put their kids to school, going to work, maybe one or two jobs or other jobs, and then coming back home late at night, taking the temperature of their kids and starting again the next day and running through the weekend. And so we really have to think about those families who are surviving day to day, and really looking at how, Carolyn, we can make sure to think about those families. I would also say that, again, we have to think of the future. And, Congress, the White House thinking of a modernization blueprint that impacts affordability, connectivity, accessibility, adaptability, future of work, upskilling, reskilling. All of this is interconnected. And when we think about who is being left behind, let me just give you an example. So many of our jobs today have transitioned from, being able to apply with a pen and paper to now having to go to a computer or a tablet and submitting your application online. But what if these same individuals who are trying to apply for these jobs do not have the skills, do not know how to connect on a laptop to the Wi-Fi, much less get to the website of the employer to be able to submit that application? So I really think we have to be very tactical in the investments that we make. It's not only, making sure we have the money for the actual program, but making sure we have the money to have those centers available for people to be able to apply. Latinos over-index in terms of smartphones, yet 1 in 3 Latinos lack access to technology and broadband. Let me just repeat that one more time. 1 in 3 Latinos lack access to technology and broadband in America. And so as we're thinking of, how do we enroll our children in education? And if the only way to enroll them is online, so many children and so many families will be left behind. It's the same thing with ACP and EBB, right? Like, how do we make sure that our communities are aware that this program exists? And how do we make sure that the safety net network is there to be able to provide that assistance to our community if nothing else is provided?
Absolutely.
As a nonprofit organization, Carolyn, I can tell you, and as the CEO, sometimes I feel that one of my jobs is not only to be a chief troublemaker, but also to figure out how do we literally make miracles happen when there's no budgets allotted to be able to do it and really think outside of the box. And, we are really fortunate that we have this network of grassroots volunteers who are passionate. And I'm just going to uplift our tech and innovation chair, Caroline Quasier out of Illinois, who literally breathes, sleeps, things, and eats technology and broadband day and night. And so I have the fortune of having my accountability partner, Carolyn, who keeps me honest, who thinks about what more can we be doing? How can we do it? Plan A, plan B, plan D, or F if needed to make sure it reaches our community. And I will tell you that when there's no budget, we will use social media. We will get our volunteers to mobilize. We will use text messaging. We will think outside of we will even resort to WhatsApp, right? Like, we will make sure we think about everything in order to reach our community.
Can I ask you, it sounds like an amazing grassroots push, something so much of America needs these days. And what else beyond broadband are you focused on in 2022? I mean, this clearly is a top focus, but I'm just curious as to what else is on your to-do list.
Whew, I'm going to take a deep breath on that, Jen, because, as a civil rights organization, not only did we have a really broad mission that encompasses so many different issues. Last year we were very happy to pass the Brandon Act, the Vanessa Guillen Act under the Defense Bill. And so that was a major win for us. And obviously, as different issues surface, we are directly involved. But I will tell you one direct issue, even before the pandemic, is the issue of food insecurity. And, this is an issue that it's impacting so many Americans across the country. There is no zip code that is untouched when it comes to food insecurity. And, one example to give you is that during the pandemic, and as LuLAC was pivoting with technology, with how do we help our community, we started doing financial resources as well as food resources to our community. And in one of those mobilizing events, actually out of Arlington, Virginia, which is a very rich county, one young mother came up to one of our LuLAC members and said, thank you for being here, because today I had to decide if I was going to be able to purchase beans, tortilla, and cooking oil, or laundry detergent. And so, so many of our communities are thinking basics, bread and peanut butter, right? Like, how do we just survive this day to make it to the next? And so food insecurity is a huge one. I would say health, right? We are not out of the pandemic. We're
No.
still seeing, Omicron, we're seeing what happens next. And, one thing that people don't know is that 5 out of 6 Latinos have to leave their houses every single day to work and get paid. I'm 1 out of the 6 that has the luxury to be home, to be able to work from my laptop, from my house, from the safety of my home. But 5 out of 6 Latinos have to leave their houses to work and get paid. And I just want us to think also of those essential workers that
Mhm.
had small children who then had to shift to online learning. What happened to those small children if their parents had to go work outside of the home and to be able to provide? There was an instance where I was touring a meat packing plant, and LuLAC was heavily involved in making sure that meat packing plants were providing PPE to families and to workers. But what we learned there is that some of the daycares were turning the children away and parents away simply because they worked at a meat packing plant where COVID-19 was spreading at high rates. And so that for us is a civil rights issue. I would absolutely have to mention the issue of representation. So making sure that Latinos are represented on corporate boards and the CC section. We have something called Latino Voices for boardroom equity and partnership with other Latino organizations. But also to give you an example close to home, as the Biden administration came in, we launched something called Proyecto 20% or Project 20%, which was to advocate for the administration to have 20% of Latinos represented. And a lot of people don't know that currently Latinos are about 18% of the total population, but in just 3 decades, 30 years, in your and my lifetime, Latinos will grow to 120 million strong, which means that 1 in 3 Americans will be of Latino ancestry. And so as we think of how do we make sure that we address these issues holistically, we have to think of Latinos as the future of America. And then I would just mention, other issues like workforce development, upskilling, reskilling, education, democracy, voting, civil rights, housing. It's a long list, Jen and Carolyn, that keeps us really busy day in and day out. But absolutely the issue of technology, again, has surfaced as a top 2 issue for us.
And I can see across all of those issues, some of which are what a lot of Americans are going through right now. Technology does seem to be positioned to really help be a lifeline, to be that common thread across all of these incredibly important issues that are being decided and being planned for. So I want to thank you. There's so much more to talk about. I want to be rude and a little selfish and ask if you would do us the big favor of coming back again, maybe in a couple
Absolutely.
months. We do one a month, just to check in and see how things are going. If the money starts hitting the ground, so to speak, towards the next year, kind of middle of the year. It would be great to touch base with you later this year to hear from you and your organization and hear what amazing things you've been accomplishing. To me, and Jen, I'd be curious, there's so many nuggets, not just one, but the overriding, I think, point I will take away from this discussion, Sindy, is number one, now is the time to be pragmatic and leverage this tremendous amount of government investment into closing the digital divide, and in every way, what closing the digital divide means, both the adoption and the access. And that from the past, we know we need to educate consumers where they are and how they want to understand it and how they can understand it, the options that are available to them now and have been, as well as new opportunities that may come to fruition once this money actually is obtained through the processes that are being set up and is actually invested in local communities, were two of the nuggets that I took away. Jen, any from you?
And I would just say, for all these dollars chasing fiber, to really frame up the community they're serving and the real needs of that community, as you so eloquently put it. So I think that sometimes it's just pure capitalism without the human element. And I think there's need for both here.
Spoken so nicely from Wall Street. Sindy, thank you so very much again, and to your team, and a shout out from us to your teammate, Caroline in the amazing job that she's been doing for you. Like I said, there's so many more things to cover, but you guys are really doing a service, not just for your own constituencies, but for all of us in bringing a lot of thought and, as Jen said, a pragmatic kind of grassroots understanding of how these sometimes viewed as theoretical issues actually affect people every day. And that's a really, really important focus that often gets lost inside the Beltway. So for today, thank you very, very much. Jen, I think we are done for our first installment in January. February, I think we're going to do the third week or the third Wednesday, but I think you and I need to confirm that before we tell the world. So everybody keep your eyes and ears open for an announcement of our next event in February. And for now, thank you all very much for joining us and hope you have a good lunch. Sindy, thank you again very much.
Thank you, Cindy.
Thank you both.
Bye-bye.
Absolutely.